Project 2's kind of skeleton, so if you want to pull that up or start from scratch, I've committed some of the files under 07 BSU maps. That's the base I'm going to start with. I did some edits before class, so it won't look exactly like that, but you can follow along. I'll kind of go through step by step. I'm not going to show the entire application and how to do it. I'm going to show how to download the JSON file with Google's Volley. I'll show you how to install that. It's very similar to installing EventBus by Green Robot, but we'll talk about Volley a little bit. I'll show you the documentation, how to install it. We'll download the JSON object. We'll do a little bit of parsing on it. We'll send it to a buildings factory. Actually, we'll parse it in the buildings factory and create some basic objects with that, and then from there you should be able to throw that into a map view. Or if you're creating these things from a details activity view or whatever you want to call it, that you should be able to accomplish the same task. And if we have time, we'll talk about that. So here's the UML document that I've created. This is an application called OmniGraffle. You can find other UML design tools. I don't think Android Studio has this built in. I know some other ones like Eclipse actually does. So if you want to use Eclipse's UML creation tool to draw this stuff out, or most of the time what I just do is paper and pencil. It's the fastest way, it's the cheapest way, and quite honestly I think it's the best way. But if you're sharing within a group of either other developers or showing this to your manager or client, or usually don't show clients this, but this is a nice way to kind of lay out your application. If you're going to be a project manager, which is what actually pays more, the people that do the real work, the programmers, they don't get paid all that much. It's the project managers that get paid more, believe it or not. And so being part of a technical project manager, your responsibility is probably to design. This is a class diagram, but OmniGraffle, which is really nice, has under the software categories here, we have flowcharts, so you can see how the application flows. We have iOS wireframes. It doesn't have Android, but you can download Android-based wireframes. You can do this in Photoshop. They have applications to do wireframing, and these just lay out your interface. But again, I just like to do paper and pencil for the most part. But if you want it to look pretty and you're presenting this to a client, then maybe you pretty it up by using an actual application to do that. But we're not going to worry about that today. Maybe for your final, if you want to put something together. That's how I always start, is to do a paper and pencil interface to draw out all the screens like I showed you before. And then once we get down to that, I'll do a UML diagram or a class diagram for laying out my classes. So I'll show you that in a second. We have this other one called UML sequence. And if we click on that just to open it up, I can show you these a little bit. This is what we call an interaction diagram. And so let's pretend that we're an application and we're talking to a server. So the application would be on your left and the server would be on the right. And you can see this is just a template, so this is just giving you one of each of these little tiny symbols. But you would have the object name, so it could be like mobile app, and then on the object name for the right, it would be like server. And then you have these messages that get sent back and forth. So from my mobile app, I might make an API call to get the locations. And the server would send a message in the opposite direction to say, okay, here's the actual JSON object. And you would include that all in the arrows. You'd say this is the call and this is what it returns. When you have more complex interactions, like, okay, I'm going to talk to the server is going to talk to another server or to a database. So you might have things further down on the ends. And so with OmniGraffle, you can actually just grab these guys. Actually, let me duplicate that, move it down here. Grab this guy, duplicate this guy. Oh, I did grab the whole thing. Duplicate that. Here, duplicate it again. And then again, you can send, oops, can make sure I grab everything. Send these objects like here. I'm just going to lay this out quickly to show you. And for these arrows, you can change the arrows directions on the arrows. Something like that to show that this is going to go back this way, and then maybe again, here. So you could say, okay, well my application is going to send your server this information, and your server is going to send me back this information, and maybe you do something on the far right on your server, but I don't really care about that. If I'm the mobile app developer, I care about this one to send you the information or send you the request, and then I care about this one to receive the response. And so this is what we're going to talk about today, is sending the request for the JSON object and then receiving that response as a JSON object. Again, what that server does on the back end, which is all this stuff, I don't really care about. If you're the server developer or the back end developer, that's your job. And so you work together and you create these diagrams as a team, and then basically everybody knows what their responsibility is. People know what API you're supposed to call, what the name of that is, what data I'm supposed to return. So this is what we call an interaction diagram. Again, it's in UML, and there are plenty of tools to use to make these if you're not interested or you have a Windows machine for OmniGraffle, because it's Mac only. But there's plenty of other ones out there. So again, we're going to start with this one. This is the one I created. The solid black lines means that the object either owns it or is responsible for it, and then the dotted lines means that it has a reference to it, but it doesn't actually own the object. That's just UML standard, but it doesn't really matter. When you're drawing these out, you can just draw arrows as long as you know what they mean. So let's go over this really quickly. Our map view is going to have a map view in it and an add button. So the ones that I've seen so far, everybody has that in there. And then below here we have messages. You probably can't see that, but you just follow my arrow there. We have an add pin and a update map. So these are two methods that we're going to have in our activity, our map view activity. In our details activity, that gets launched via the add pin method. So that add pin is going to have an intent. That intent's going to launch the details activity. Inside details activity, we're going to have our name text field, should be actually text view, description text view, and then we have another method here. I usually put these as minus signs for instance methods, and if you have a plus sign, that's a class method. Just again, UML notation. Let me increase this view while I'm kind of in here. I can probably get rid of this as well.
And that details activity is where the camera is.
Correct. Yes. Yeah, so actually, that's a good point. I didn't think about that. I would have another one probably in here called launch camera. You can name it whatever you want, of course. But yeah, so that's. I would look at my wireframes for my details activity, and I would say, I would have all the text views laid out. Okay, I need a reference to that, so let me add a member. I'd have a reference to this, let me add another member. Okay, well, I need to save that pin, so let me have a save pin method. And then, oh, I have a camera button on there, so let me have a button, a click listener to handle the click on the camera button. And so that's kind of how I work, is I look at my interface and I kind of think about what I need references to in terms of UI. Not every UI element needs a reference to it. Like if it's just static, if a static image or static text, you obviously don't need a reference to it because you're not manipulating it in code. But for everything that you need to manipulate in code, you need a reference to, and therefore it's probably a good idea to put that as a member variable, just so you have a reference to it. You don't have to keep looking that up, because the lookup process actually is very slow and inefficient. The find by ID is kind of slow. If you guys know anything about JavaScript, the find element by ID is the same thing, the equivalent in JavaScript, but that's also very slow operation. So don't always be looking up your widgets. If you need the widget, just store it in a member variable. They're pretty cheap to do that, so that's just an optimization tip. Yeah, and that's fine. And if you want, you can have like a cancel button, but usually the back button acts as the cancel, so I'm just going to leave that alone. Okay, and so those are our main activities. I should probably name this map view activity. Okay, so now all the stuff under the hood, how does this actually work? Well, our two activities, no matter which one you're on, has a reference to the building's controller because it's a singleton. That's denoted by that little S there. And we have some methods here. We have add location, remove location, and just locations. That gets an array of locations. In Java, you probably want to name this get locations and add location, remove locations. So it's going to accept a location model object. What I'm going to do is actually duplicate this guy so that I can create the location model. It is not a singleton. And inside my location model, I am going to have members of, it's going to have a location name, and this is just going to be a string. You can, I'm putting colon string. Over here I'm putting it in parentheses. You can do it whatever you want. Location description, which is also a string. And then I'm going to have an actual location coordinate. And these are going to be of type lat long, which is part of the Android/Google library for latitude, longitude. And I am just going to have my normal getters and setters, so I'm not going to actually have anything in that lower section there. Okay, and so my buildings controller, I guess I could draw, where's my line tool here? Just draw a line there, just so my buildings controller, and basically everybody's going to know about the location model. This is just a import. You don't really have to know about this actual class, so let me just remove that, because it's just going to get imported and then we create these and there's really no methods on them, so I'm just going to leave them as is. But what's most important is when I go ahead and add that location or remove that location, we're going to use EventBus to announce to everybody that a location has been removed or added. And then my buildings controller, what I don't have in here actually is a method to, and these are all class methods by the way. So this one's going to be a class method. This class method is going to be called refresh locations. And it's not going to accept any parameters. And what that's going to do is essentially just going to go out to my web services controller and call retrieve locations on that. We'll show you how to do that with Google's Volley. And then we have a buildings factory. That buildings factory is going to accept JSON objects. They're actually strings, and so you pass those in as strings and it's going to return you a array list. Or we can create a single object from JSON. So we're allowing this to be a little bit more flexible, but that's going to return a single location model. So I'm just making an API that's a little bit more flexible. Theoretically, you could just have one API that handles them all, but again, I like to be a little bit more flexible. Okay, so that's what we have in our UML documentation here. So we're going to actually get this to match up. So I started this, so if you want to follow along in 07 BSU maps, which is in the example code, I pushed that up before class, that we have some classes in here, but I need to get rid of the old get resource task, because this is using an async task inner class, and I don't want that anymore because I'm going to use Volley instead of using the async task. And let's just import some of this stuff. So refresh locations, which I've named in my UML. This is using some old code, so I'm going to get rid of that. Actually, that one. And we don't need this class anymore. That class doesn't even exist. And let's start importing some of these things here. Okay, so step number 1. Oops. Besides importing all these objects here. Okay, so there's a lot of red text in here, mostly because my request queue does not exist. So let's go ahead and create that. It's going to be a private member of type request queue. But as you can see, it doesn't exist, but I'm going to go ahead and just create it because step number 1 is to go to the documentation. So I've looked this up prior. This is actually not the exact library. This is a mirror of Google's Volley, and so they keep it in sync. But what this allows me to do is it allows me to actually import it via Gradle Now I was looking this up, and to do it normally as it is now, you have to import a jar file. You have to download the code, compile it to a jar file. That's too slow. I don't want to take the time in class. And because we're using Gradle, which is our dependency management, it's a build/dependency management, we're able to just copy this line of code, and this address here, reverse domain, allows us to hit a repository and download that code automatically. So I showed you how to do that with EventBus, but if we go to the projects build.gradle file, this one, oh, I'm sorry, it's the module, it's the entire applications one, sorry. So yeah, just make sure you see the compile ones in there. I always forget which one it is exactly. So we've already included the green robot from the example code previous class. I'm going to paste that in, and that's all I have to do to import this entire nice library that somebody else developed for us. Hit save, but now you notice at the top there's a yellow banner that goes across saying that your Gradle file has changed, but it's not synced up. So again, we can do this two ways. We can click this sync now, but if you don't see this or you're having issues, you can always hit the Gradle sync button here. I'm sure there's other ways to do it, probably in the menu, but I'm just going to go ahead and let's just pick one, do it. And what it's going to do is download that file in the background, and I can continue to work on my application in the meantime. Okay, looks like that was done anyway. Let me return my view. Okay, so let's go back to our web services controller. You can see our web services controller. I'm going to gut it out. I'm going to refactor it. I removed all our async stuff, but we still have our host URL and our REST endpoint. A REST endpoint is just a static JSON file, but we're going to use that to construct our file. And what I've done is included example code that I've already had from another project. That's usually the way I work. If I've done something before, I'm not going to go ahead and look it up in the documentation. I'm just going to copy it in the previous project and then copy it in. So that's what I've done, but it's pretty easy to do. So now it's asking me, okay, import com.android.volley. Yes, please. By hitting Option Enter. Oops. Send it go away. Okay. Also our request. Oh, request. Request. I was close. Q. Okay. And so that should go away. Yes, question.
Sorry if you already explained this.
No problem.
The web services controller class that you're in right now.
Yep.
That is something that we'll also be making as part of the project too.
Yes.
Okay. So in the UML diagram, it's buildings controller. It's the same thing, right?
Nope. So the buildings controller has a reference to the web services controller.
So web services is the same thing as web services controller. You're just making it differently.
Yep. Let me rename that.
And each of those boxes is its own class.
Yes, exactly. So we call this a class diagram because each one of these boxes is a class. So, yep. Good questions.
Seems pretty obvious. Isn't it?
No, a lot of students haven't seen UML documentation before. I'm not sure if they showed in the software engineering class. When I took my software engineering class, there was literally no code to the projects that we were developing. It was all develop the UML documentation, and so that taught me a lot about how to build actual classes and everything. So if you haven't taken that class, I highly recommend it because it was one of the best classes I took when I was in school. But yeah, good question. So sometimes those don't match up. So yeah, my web services controller is the same as my web services. I just, yeah, didn't have the names proper. Let's see, so this one, oh, it's static. Public static. Okay, yeah, because I'm using it in a static class, I need to use a static member. And we just import all these things. Okay, so for the string requests that I'm going to create, this is part of the Volley library, I believe. The one I'm previously using is using a Google API to pass in a latitude and a longitude, and that's going to get me the address or the county or the street or whatever level I want. I showed it in the last class, but I don't really care about that. What I do care about is the host URL and the WS, which stands for Web Services, get locations. And I like doing that because WS, whenever I type it into autocomplete, will show me all of my web services endpoints. And then I do get, and that's a get request as opposed to a post or put, delete, that sort of thing. So that's just how I name it. And then locations, because obviously it's getting locations for that. Or the buildings, they're kind of the same thing. Now, when I construct this, you just do string concatenation, ws underscore get locations, and then this is the rest of the code for this. Let's see, try. I think I have a missed catch block here. Yeah, when I pasted this and I kind of gutted it, so just make sure all these classes get imported. We have a Volley error object that needs to be imported. Okay.
So this is 07 Bronco maps, right?
Yes, but I've added stuff before class, so you probably don't have this in here. But what we're going to do is we have this request. We are going to pass in some response handlers. So a response handler is on response, so on response from the server. What we're going to do is just log that response to see what it looks like in order to parse it. So what I've done is I've created an initial JSON object, and I'm going to inspect that in code. But what I know for a fact is when I do the response in the browser, that the root element is actually an array, so this is a square bracket. And within it, it has 3 objects denoted by the curly braces. So let's just go ahead and see, for the most part, if this will run for us. We'll have to do a little bit of extra work. Let's see. Just clean this up a little bit. And so that volley error, yeah, there we go. The import is elusive. There we go. Okay. I don't know why they don't. Just be patient with these things. It was turning red. It was saying, do you want to import this library? But for some reason, it wasn't picking it up. Eventually, it figured it out. And everything looks good. I still have some errors. Response listener. What I was going to do is go to the documentation for Volley. So if you go to the Google Android developers page, you can see some of the stuff on here. And what they do is they create the string outside example.com. They pass that in here. They do request get on it. And then here's the response handler. And let's see, they have a listener, response listener. Yeah, so my code should match up. Get recent context call. Okay, let's just copy theirs and maybe. Maybe have an old version of the library or something like that. Okay. Okay, so what Volley needs is a context, and I kind of explained this a couple times before, but the context is really the context that's making this call. And so we need this as a parameter, so context, context. And let this import. This is an Android content context. Invalid method decoration, return type required. Yes, I need to return that type. I'm just going to have void. This method's not going to return anything. It's just going to run, and then it's going to download the data and then pass it to the buildings controller and then do that response. But so this class actually doesn't do anything. So maybe I should just say, instead of get, because you're not returning anything, let's just say refresh locations. Or maybe even retrieve, but refresh is fine. And okay, all the little red squigglies have gone away, so we're good here. So I'll leave that up on the screen for 2 seconds as I kind of talk about it. The if statement in the initial request is checking to make sure that our request queue, which we only have one of, if that's set to null, that means we've never initialized it. So in that case, initialize it. Volley.newRequestQueue, passing in the context that's calling it the original one. And then below that, I don't actually need this location anymore, so let me go ahead and delete that. And this is how Volley does its request. So you set up a request a string request, excuse me, and as the first parameter you pass in the URL. What I can do is actually pull this out because this is kind of ugly. I'm going to highlight it, right click on it, go to refactor, go to extract, and make a variable out of that. And then yeah, URL's fine, okay. And where that gets it from is the documentation for string request. It's looking for a string and the string name in the parameter for the document or for the declaration of string request is called URL. So that's where it gets it from. And yeah, that looks good there. So make my code a little bit more readable. And then we have a response listener, and inside the response listener we have an on-response to the debug log, and then just creating a JSON object. But I mentioned because the root was an array, a JSON array I should say, I'm going to create a JSON array object, change all these to array. Alright, so that it parses it properly. Otherwise I think it errors out. Okay, so now I need to go ahead and call this, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to call it the first thing when my application launches, because this is a web service, and the web service takes anywhere from 0 to, I mean, the sky's the limit, but a second, 2 seconds, and especially on mobile it could take up to 30 seconds to download all this data. So I want to call it as soon as I can, and that's going to be in my launcher activity, which in this case is called maps activity. Let me go back to my UML documentation and make sure I have everything. This is called maps activity. Okay, and so in my onCreate, essentially where I can call this. I can't really call it anywhere before that because I don't, well, I guess I could, but let's just do in my onCreate, keep things simple. Otherwise I'd have to think about the life cycle and when things are created, because if you do it too early, certain things aren't created yet and you might call it and nothing happens. So our web services controller dot refresh locations, and then it's asking me for the context, so I'm going to pass in just this. So that's all you have to do. Anytime you see a context, it's usually looking for an activity. If you're in a fragment, you actually have to get the parent activity's context and then pass it in that way. So again, if I was calling this web services refresh locations in a fragment, instead of this, what I'd have to do is, again, get a reference to the parent activity and then pass that in instead, because fragments do not have context. Okay, so let's just see if this runs. I'm going to hit Control R, and that is my Genymotion. Yep, so that'll be fine. Oops. Way over here. Dismiss that. Oh, I got an error here. Okay, so it says request location updates. If I double click on that, oh, it's already on the screen. My location updates location manager is having an error. No suitable method found. Okay, I am not interested in my locations manager, so I'm just going to hit command / to comment that out. We'll talk about the, yeah.
Can you briefly describe location manager? Are we going to be using that?
Yes, so you need to get the location of the device, and so you'll be using this code, which I've posted in the example code folder before class. You'll call start reporting, location reporting, and then it'll just grab GPS data from the device and start using it, storing it.
So we need to make a location manager object.
Yeah, the locations controller code is up on the repository, so you can just copy that into your project. You have to fill it in with actual logic, but that's the skeleton of it's there. So you can see on location change, meaning the user has moved. That is going to do locations controller .current location and then update that the location. So whatever's passed in as a GPS coordinate for that location, it'll pass it in and store it in that object, and then you can then you can retrieve it.
What's the refresh on that again? How often do you check?
That's a good question. So the question was, how often does it refresh? And that is defined when you do your location manager. Let's find the declaration of that. Yeah, so here, location manager, it's going to be the default, but location manager, oh, I forget what these are off the top of my head.
Because if you want to, like, if you want to manually set that to be a 10 minutes, let's say.
Yep.
They got to be in a spot 10 minutes, and all of a sudden it's like, okay, something happens.
Yeah, you set the distance filter on that to say if you've moved, 10 meters or 10 kilometers to then update it. Usually you don't do it by time. Yeah, which is more efficient if you do it by distance, because if the user's not moving, then you really don't care. I do have that in an example code previously. I'm not going to try to remember off the top of my head for this. Yeah, no problem there. So okay, so that all runs fine. Let me go back into my web services controller. I am going to put a breakpoint here, and then within my response, I can look at my messages or not my messages, my output here. It's a bunch of output that I don't really care about, so I'm going to switch from in verbose mode. I'm going to do a filter on my initials and say could not find GMS. Okay, let me just rerun this real quick and see where we are at. This is good practice for you guys that are struggling with your projects and wondering what these errors are. So, okay, so I put a breakpoint there. I ran the app, and because we're calling it the first thing, you can see that it got this breakpoint got stopped here. If I go down to my debug, which is down here in the bottom left-hand corner, clicking on that, you can see these are my variables that I have in scope. So I have an object called request queue, and it looks like it has been initialized. It's not null. Let me step over this string URL by clicking on this button here. And you can hover over URL to see what the URL is. And that looks good. I don't have any extra forward slashes. Sometimes I have a forward slash at the end of my host URL and then before my REST endpoint, so then I have two together. So yeah, just make sure the URL looks proper, because if you're doing a request on an improperly formed URL, you'll get an error. Okay, so I also have a breakpoint within my on response. I'm also going to put one in my debug one just in case. Hit the play button to continue, and hopefully this comes back. Oh, what I forgot to do, oh wait, okay, I was going to say I forgot to actually call the thing, but it does. Okay, so that's just not getting called at all. Which is strange. Yeah, that was the previous code that I had there. Okay, yeah, that was a really long timeout. So maybe in development you can set that timeout to be a shorter timeout, and this will come back as errors. Okay, so it said it could not resolve host. Oh, that's right. This server was down last night, and I forgot to put it back up. So for some reason that went down. So what I'm going to actually do is restart that server. If you guys are not familiar with AWS,
No.
this is just where I run a lot of my servers. I got 2 instances running, and the thing that I have for some reason not running is the one server. So if you actually go to the website, actually, well, this guy returns just fine. That is interesting. I have a ping monitor on my website that like 2 o'clock in the morning said, hey, the website's down. And I just didn't care to actually restart it, and I forgot about it all day today. So anyway, no address associated with host name. Let's make sure. Usually what I'll do is I'll copy this, paste it in, just construct it. I guess I can run the app, but just paste that in, and yeah, that seems to work. So let me just get rid of that. Unknown host. Okay, the next thing I'm going to check is make sure my Genymotion app has, or actually has access to any information. So I'm going to open up Chrome, which I guess was back here. I'll just open up the Android browser, it's fine. Just go to good old google.com. Okay, so I know my computer's network is working. The Genymotion network seems to be down. Let me just confirm this. Google's not down. That works fine. Okay, let me restart Genymotion. Let me do my Nexus 7, just as a different emulator. These are real life issues that you might have. You're like, why is
My
this?
life.
Exactly.
Are you kidding?
This was my weekend.
Yeah. It's, as I say, it's not what you know, it's how you know how to fix the problem. And so let's open up Chrome on this guy. Oops. Okay, that seems to work. Let's just type in Google. Okay, so that's working just fine. So let's use this emulator instead. I don't know if that was an issue or it just needed to be restarted. Sometimes Genymotion just needs to be restarted. Let's rerun that on my 7. Oh yeah, that's right. This one doesn't have. Okay, but we don't need Google Maps to work. Let me run this in debug mode. I forgot to run this in debug mode. So it didn't hit my breakpoints. It just ran through my breakpoints because I hit the Control R instead of Control D. So now that and here's the other thing: when you're running 2 connections in a row without shutting it down, it says connection refused down here. So I ran it. I didn't touch the code, and it should just run. But you just hit it again. That's a recent bug. I'm not sure why that happens, but if you have an error like that, just run it again, see what happens. Okay, so now my breakpoint's being hit. This string is constructed. I know it's a good, valid string. I'm going to hit this play button to continue through it. And almost instantly, it jumps into the onResponse, which is a good sign because now my response string, you can scroll over here and see this kind of like a comment that's my JSON object that came back. So that's good news. What I'm going to do is now spit it out to the screen by stepping over this line of code. So log.d will spit it out to the debug log, which I can access if you look at the bottom here, which says Android monitor. If I click on that, you can see all the output for that, and that's what I was trying to filter down on. Oh, this one was called tag. So I filtered on this guy, which is my tag. Sometimes I call it MZ. Let me just make it consistent there. So you can see that it spit out my response string, which is just this. So this looks exactly like the code that I downloaded. And so that's how you download code from a web server. Very, very simple. Just follow the Volley documentation to get this. Again, I just copied and pasted. You can go to the Volley documentation itself, and I think here. I didn't do this because I had previous code, but just copy this and paste it into your project and then start manipulating it. Because for the life of me, I can never remember these API calls. I just copy and paste from the documentation, or Code Complete helps me out. So try to learn enough so that you can easily do these types of operations. So just looking up the documentation, Google is actually the fastest way. Android Studio has its own built-in documentation, but yeah, so I just use Google for the most part. Okay, so now that we actually have that string being downloaded and in our response string object, I'm going to pass that response string object into my JSON array. I'm going to step over this code and hopefully it stays in scope. I'll switch over to the debug tab. I'm going to step over that and I don't think it stays in scope, so unfortunately that variable goes away because it's now out of scope, it's only locally. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to log that to the debug here, and I'm just going to say JSON array. And this one, let's see, I'm just going to do toString because it's accepting a string. I don't know if that'll work or what that looks like. I don't really care. I just want to have another line of code that I can execute so that I can inspect the JSON array object here. So I'm not even worrying about the interface at this point. I'm just getting my web services to download our data so that I can then parse it. I'm going to remove this breakpoint because I no longer care. So I'm going to hit play through that, wait for my response to come back. Response looks good, step over. Now I have my JSON array. Hopefully this gets parsed if I step over it. Because I'm still in that code block, I have the scope. I have this variable in scope, so now I can inspect it. Before, what happened is when I clicked stepped over, it came way down here and that variable just got garbage collected or whatever, went out of scope. I can't access it anymore. So if that ever happens to you, just put an extra line of code after it. You can also step into it. That'll also work too. Step into it and then step out of it, and that'll come back and assign it there. But looking at it, it actually looks pretty good. If I open this up, I can see I have 3 values. Sorry if you can't see that, but it says size equals 3. So that's good, and if I disclose that, I can look at each object individually, and each object within that has 3 pairs of other objects. One is location, and description and name, and so if I expand the description, in this case it's equal to blue turf, I have a key, which is called description, a value, which is blue turf, and I can go within that, but that's all I really care about. And then my location object, if you remember, that's a sub-object. So going back to our original here, location is equal to another object that has a key, 2 keys in it, latitude and longitude with values in it. And so that's represented in this object as well as a nested object. And so this has a key of location and a value of another object. And then if I drill down into that, I can see that that has 2 keys, latitude, longitude, and Android Studio constructs that for you. It says longitude is equal to this, latitude is equal to that. I can drill down even farther. Key is equal to longitude, value is equal to that, and then I can go down a little bit farther just to get the value there. So this is our structure. This is our data structure that we're going to work with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep this up so that I have a reference to what my object actually looks like, or you could just go back to what this is. So I have the root object already. So our JSON array object looks like this. It is an array, and inside of that array we have 3 objects. So what I want to do is I want to create objects from each individual object here. Each individual object is going to be called location model. Model comes from model view controller. Model is just our data. So what I'm going to do is I already have a location model created. So I have location coordinates, location name, and location description. These match up with my JSON object. I don't have getters and setters, so I'm going to hit Command N, go down to getter and setter, hit enter on that, highlight all of these by hitting shift and then down arrow to highlight those, then hit OK. That auto-generates my getters and setters. And I'm going to go ahead and close that because that's all my model is. It's just a place to store these variables. Go back to my web services, close some of these windows. Okay, so initially I'm just going to do the code here, but then I'm going to refactor and put it somewhere else. But just because sake of simplicity, I want to get this application, this is how I work. I want to get this application to work before I worry too much about the architecture of it. I've already defined how I want the architecture to look like. Right now I'm just trying to get this to work. And I highly recommend you guys do the same because I know a lot of you are just like struggling on getting it to pull down. And if you're worrying about pulling it down and then passing it to another class, it just adds one more variable of, error to, have that cause you issues. So I know it works here. I know my JSON array is being populated, so I'm just going to go ahead and loop through that. I could do a for each loop, but I'm just going to do a simple old regular, so index equals 0, index is less than the JSON array dot length, and index plus plus. So that's just a simple plain old for loop, and what it's going to do is start from index 0 and go through all the objects in my JSON array, namely 0 through the third object. But if you look at if I just close that, it's basically 0, 1, and 2 will be my indices for that. And so what I want to do is I want to create a location model called current location model equal to new location model. Constructor is just going to be blank. And then what I'm going to do is for all my setters, so current location model set, and then location coordinate description name, I'm going to start out with a name. I'm going to leave that. Let me just fill it in with a string so I don't get errors. Current location model, set description, empty string, and current location model set coordinate. But what the coordinate is looking for is a lat long object. So what I'm going to do here is just do lat long, or I'm sorry, new lat long, and then an empty constructor. And that should, no, okay. Let me just do 20, comma 20. Oh, wait, nope, that's not how this works. Those are not strings, those are actually should be doubles. Okay, so what I'm doing now is obviously I'm hard coding this because I don't want to worry too much about having this be reliant on what's in my current JSON array object. I just want to make sure that this works. And so what I probably do is run this just to make sure that it's creating my location model, that it's passing in the lat long properly, and then everything works. And then what I'm going to do is I have a buildings controller. Let me see what I've named that. Actually, I do not have a buildings controller yet. Okay, so let me go ahead and create that. It's just a regular Java class, so buildings controller. And again, referring back to your UML class diagram. We're going to take a look at that just to see what we need. So buildings controller has a buildings array, refresh locations, yada yada. I'm not going to worry about that right now, but I just want that object in there, and a public static. Actually, I do have a buildings controller. It's called locations controller, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. Let me step back here. I'm going to delete that. I wasn't thinking. I'm going to refactor this to rename it and be consistent with my UML documentation. And don't be afraid of renaming your classes because this refactor tool is really powerful. So it called it buildings controller, and what it also did is in my web services controller, in my imports, if I expand this, I can see that if I scroll down somewhere in here, oh I haven't, okay. Well, if I had that imported, what it would actually do is change the name of my import, but I actually hadn't imported that yet, so if I do that and I go back up to imports, it'll say buildings controller somewhere. Or maybe not. Oh, it's part of the package, that's why. Okay. What I was going to say is if it wasn't part of the package, it would also rename that import. Alright, sorry, I wasn't thinking. Okay, so now that I have that buildings controller, let me go and see what I have for methods. Expand this a little bit. Okay, so I have add location that accepts an entire array, and I have an add location that accepts a location object itself. So I have two methods. One accepts a single object, one accepts many objects. And the single one looks kind of a little bit more, let's see, location. I going to change this to new location. Okay. All right, so what this guy is going to do, what's it looking for? New location, oops, that location. Oh, okay, string. Let me refactor this really quickly. So this should be a location model, location model, get location, location model, match that up, set location, and location model equals the passed in string. Well, it's not a string, it is a location model. I'm just changing the types on this. Okay, so this is my event class, and this is the thing that we're going to send out to the world as a broadcast or as an observer pattern. Okay, so that all looks good. I do have some errors because of that. Okay, yeah, if your class up here has a little squiggly line under there, it means you have a compiler error. This should be get location. Oh, it should be called set location, and pass in here. Okay, so let's resume where we were. So in my web services controller, I'm going to parse out that object, and then I'm going to pass it into this method that is our buildings controller. Normally this would probably accept an entire string and then pass it as a factory, but again, I don't want to worry too much about it. I just want to get this to work, and I want to set up my classes so that it at least compiles. So buildings controller dot add location singular, and I'm going to pass in this current location model that we're currently constructing. Okay, so this is going to loop 3 times. It's going to create an empty object to store our name, description, and coordinate in, and then it's going to add it to my buildings controller. That's all I really care about. I would run that and make sure that this happens 3 times. If it doesn't, I'd have to look at my code and figure out what the error is and start from there. Incremental steps. Because if you try to do too much at one time and you run into an error, you don't know where your error occurred, and then you have to step through all your code. This is actually going to work, so I am going to, well, I assume it's going to work. I'm going to go ahead and actually parse this out. So the way that we do this is, because this object, this array has 3 objects in it, and I have the index for each one, I'm going to say that I'm going to put this all into a JSON object, because every object in the JSON array is a JSON object. So I'm going to create a new JSON object from that, new JSON object. And in the constructor, I'm going to pass in the JSON array dot get. Okay, this actually has a get. So when I do get JSON object and pass it the index of it, it'll return me array. So I don't have to do the new keyword. So let me hit enter and just do that instead. This is a little convenience method that they have set up. And it's going to pass, it's going to require the index. Okay, so that's actually a nice, better way of doing that. So get JSON object, pass in the index, it'll store it in this JSON object. And this is all in the course notes. But I'm going to go ahead and do this really quickly. So JSON object, get string, and the string is looking for a key. So let me go back to my keys here. This one's just called name. So I'm going to put a name there. And then set description is looking for a JSON object get string. In this key for the description, okay, this first one, what the? Oh, okay, this is. Okay, that's the key for that. Sorry, the formatting was throwing me off. So this key is going to be description. So when I extract this guy, it's going to get that value blue turf in this case, pass it into my current location model, and construct that. Now for my latitude, I can't actually do that because that's a more complex type. What I'd have to do instead is refactor this guy, create a lat-long object. I'm just going to call that lat-long equals. Again, I'm going to hard code this, put this in here, and then I'd run it to make sure that works, maybe. But these values here are actually pretty important, but they're kind of a little difficult to get out. So I have to say, let me just do this. So, oops, yeah, okay. Double. This is going to be called the latitude equals JSON object dot get double, and then the key for that is latitude. But you'll notice something. After this is not the right way to do it, but give me 2 seconds. Longitude. Okay, and then instead of these values here, I'm going to pass in the latitude, comma, longitude, and that's kind of how you do it, except for one problem. That's not going to work because this JSON object doesn't have a key called latitude. There's actually a sub-object, which I need to get. This is going to be another JSON object, and that's going to represent this object here, the entire object here, because it's a nested object. So I'm going to call that location object, and that's going to be just JSON object dot get JSON object, pass it in the key, which is location. Actually, let me just copy and paste that, just because sometimes I don't copy that, type it in properly. And then again, I'd probably make these all constants, but we're running out of time, so get that. And then now that I have that location object, I replace this here. So now we're getting the double value from this object, which represents this object instead, because it's a nested object. So just keep that in mind. I hit save on the wrong one. Okay, and so that should work. Let me put my breakpoint in here. Let me get rid of that break.
Latitude on the longitude there, is that a problem?
Oh yes, thank you, because I copied and pasted. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the values would have been the same, and that's what I was going to actually. So at this point, I'm not so sure my code is going to work. You know, I do this so often that I kind of know this is going to work. Sometimes I forget, but I've written so much code at this point, I don't know if it's going to work. So what I'm doing is putting a breakpoint right at my for loop. I know that my web service works. Did I? Okay, just want to make sure I hit debug mode. So I know my web service already works. Hopefully my server's still up. That'll download the file, and then hopefully get to this breakpoint at some point, but maybe. Let me just rerun that. I think I hit Control R instead of Command R. Okay, connection refused. Let me rerun that again. Okay, yeah, so I guess I hit Control R and it didn't hit the breakpoint, because at that point everything above that I know works. Now I've written code that I'm not so sure works. So here's my for loop. I can inspect my JSON array to make sure that it has 3 objects in there. I can look down here. Let me expand this real quick. Size says 3, so I should expect this for loop to go 3 times. So let me just expand this code. I'm going to step over. You can hit F8 if you want. I'm just going to hit the button. So location model is just going to create an empty object. Now this is kind of important. I want to make sure that this get JSON object from index 0 actually returns the object I'm expecting. So let's step over that. Now let's inspect this. And it's really important that you inspect this the first time that you do it, because for whatever reason, if it's not getting it correctly and you're getting some weird results down here in the code, it might be because up above you messed up or you're not getting the value that you're expecting. So my JSON object, if I hover over that, it is saying that my description, my name is Bronco Stadium Blue Turf. So let me just confirm that, Bronco Stadium Blue Turf. Great, because the other ones is Morris Center Wood Turf and Morrison Center 2 Wood Turf. That's a joke because it's the basketball stadium, not the football stadium. And so that looks good. So I've gotten the first object. Normally that would take me half a second to just verify that, but just showing you how I work. And then my set location name and set description, what I've done is I combine these 2 statements. There's actually this is technically a statement that then gets passed into another statement, namely a method. What I'm going to do for that is I'm going to hit this arrow over here called step into, and I'm going to step into that code, and it is giving me an exception, which that's kind of what I was doing. Okay, hold on a second. Let me, okay, so that stepped over the code, but let me hover over current location model. Actually, let's just do it down here. Look, current location model. Okay, so it did, oh, okay. I don't know why it brought me to the exception. Maybe I didn't step into it properly. But if I look and actually look at it, you probably can't see that, but it does say location name equals Brockland Stadium. So that executed fine, which is why I stepped through every single line of code the first time I write it. Set description, let me just step over that. And indeed, this got updated to blue turf. Now for my location object, because this is a nested type, this is a little bit more complex. Step over that, hover over that. That should be a complex type. Yep, latitude, longitude. Okay, then I'm going to pull those values out, step over that, latitude, longitude, hover over that. You could also look down here too to find those values. So 43.0, whatever, those are actual values for that. Now I'm going to construct a new object with those values, and hopefully that works. And then I'm going to pass that new value into my model. Now everything works. Now I'm going to pass that object to my buildings controller. That gets sent in here. I stepped into it, but it's going to get this object, so I'm actually going to step into it again. Now this is the method that I've stepped into in my buildings controller. It's going to add that to the array. If I hover over my locations array, make sure that it's initialized, because if it's null, I've already initialized it here in the class decoration, but I'm going to make sure that it's initialized, because sometimes if you assume that this code runs and you step over it and your application crashes, it might throw you into a different part of your application, and then you'll lose where you were. So I always like to make sure that what I'm going to execute is what I'm expecting to execute. So this array has 0 in it. Now if I step over that and I hover over it again, the size should be 1. Okay, everything works. Now what I'm going to do is, now that I've added that location to my array, I'm going to broadcast that out. I do that by creating an add location event. This is just my own class that I've created. That's going to create an empty version of that. I'm going to kind of package it, this new location object within the within that event. So that now that event, if I hover over it, has, if I hit this plus button actually, I can bring up this little menu. So this is my location model that's bundled within that. That's fine. And then I'm going to say EventBus, get default EventBus, and then post that event to anybody that cares about it. And I do believe my maps activity cares about it. Yep, so I have a breakpoint there. So if I hit the play button, you can see now that this on event was called, but if I go to the stack trace, which is, oh wait, well, we're running out of time, so I'll just move on. This is just getting called. You might have actually several on events being called, but now I can look at this add event menu. Add event menu, come on. Ugh, okay. Sometimes that doesn't work. I can inspect it, and in here, I can just say, hey, my map view, oops, map here, and then do my add annotation for the pin. So I can add pins here now, and then when you have other classes, you can do that as well. Or you can say buildings controller, get locations, which will return an array, then you can set all the pins. You can wipe out the map and then set all the pins manually. So it's up to you how you want to do it. Now we have a few more minutes left, so let me go into our, we don't have a details controller. Let's see, let me just add that really quickly. We're going to add an activity, so go down here, I'm going to add a blank activity. I'm going to call that details activity. That looks good. Okay, Gradle needs to sync apparently because it needs to add a bunch of stuff for me. I'm going to skip the interface for that. I am going to jump right into the code. So in my onCreate, I have to let EventBus know, or default, get default, register this. So I'm telling it register this, but I also care about the add location event. So I need to do a public void on event, and this is just how you declare it. This is the same for every callback that you need on EventBus, so on event, the type matters. So add location event, new location event is what I like to call it, new location, or actually I should say new, I'll just call it add location event. And there you go, you can do your own construction for your details, maybe something gets added in the background, but actually I don't really care about this. What I want to do, that's just illustrating that I can get events in two different classes. What I want to do is I want to set up a click listener. Click listener. This would be set up for maybe my save button, but for this guy, I'm going to say when it gets clicked that I want to do EventBus get default post, and then new add location event here. And then what I would normally do is gather all the information from my text views. So I'd have all my text views, pull the data out of it, pull it from the name. So maybe I have a string name. I'm just going to set this to blank string description equals blank. And again, I'd pull that from one of my text views. And then construct my location model object. Moving kind of quickly, but here, set this equal to name, and location model, set the descriptions to description. And then actually maybe I pull this out to its own variable, call that location event, location. Okay, so what I've done here is, and actually, let's see, then I would probably call finish. This would be on my save. Let's call it on click listener save. So I hit that save button. What I'm going to do is I'm going to grab, let's see, what is the issue here? Finish. Okay, so that should finish my activity. I'm not going to worry about that right now, but that's how you kill the activity, go back to the parent activity. So what I'm doing is I'm grabbing the strings from my text edits that are on the interface. I didn't create the interface just to save time, but you'd get that by doing find view by ID, and then on that text edit, getting the value for that, and then setting it to these variables. And then what I'm doing here is I'm constructing a location model. I'm populating the name, the description, and then what I do is I go out to the locations manager, get the current location, and also add that. So actually, let me do that right now because that's easy to do. Set location coordinates, and then do location manager, location. Location. No, I said it's not my buildings controller actually. It's kind of confusing, sorry. Get current location, that's where I have the functionality. And then it's expecting a lat long, so I'd have to pull this out to a lat long object. No, let's see. I have to do one more step. I'd have to do the constructor. Dot get latitude, and then sorry, this is sometimes a little bit too verbose. Get longitude. Okay, so that's how I get the current user's latitude and longitude, and then I pass that into my location model to finally get all that set up. So this is what you need to do for constructing your object to then pass to your buildings constructor, and then I'm broadcasting that out and then finally posting that. Yes, question?
So that click listener handles whatever the user inputs into those two separate text fields for their sign up to like add their PIN, as well as it automatically reads their lat long location and sends all that info to EventBus.
Yeah, so something like this. let's just call this name text data. Yeah, whatever the idea is for this. You're pretty, actually then I would do, yeah, just to make this clear so you're not confused, this would be name, yep, text edit. And then I would have a string called name, name, yeah, name's fine. Name text edit dot, let's see, get text, I believe, and then that would be a get string. Try to remember off the top of my head. I think that's right. Yeah, it's not recognized in the text edit. Eventually, I guess it will, and then you can add it. So yeah, that's what you would do for your details activity, and then you pull all those values out of your UI, construct your model, and then all I'm doing is posting it. And then probably what you would do back in your maps object is you'd get that notification as well, and then you'd add that pin to the map, or you'd wipe out all your pins and then grab all the pins and populate it that way. So that's the gist of project 2. Again, you're going to download the JSON object. That's not it here. Wait, where's my web services controller? That seems to disappear. We're grabbing the JSON object, we're parsing it, we're looping through. All this is in the class notes. I will post some of this stuff. I'll post bits and pieces of it, and so you can have kind of a framework to work from. But this is creating all your models. Put them in. What you should do is actually take all this stuff and put it into a buildings factory, just for ease of use. Because when project 3 comes around, you'll wish you had. Again, I'm just doing it all in here to make everything simple. Once I know everything's working, then I'll refactor, pull everything out. And when I pull things out, I usually break things. And so I'll pull it out, run it, break it, fix it, and then continue pulling things out and refactoring it. But again, I want to make sure I get things working because I've already defined my architecture, so I know what I should do and how I should do it. Let's revisit our architecture real quick for the last second. These are pretty familiar to you. Most of our work today was done in the buildings controller. I have a method called refresh locations. That was the actual thing that went ahead and got the locations, but in the web services, I would pass that JSON data, all that code we wrote. I would normally pass it into a buildings factory, which would create my objects for me. That way our logic is central to my buildings factory, and then that would send out the broadcast, and the broadcast would get over back to these guys if they care about them, and do it that way. So really the only thing that you need to know about in addition for project 3 is our location model, or not our location model, our location services, or our locations controller to grab the GPS, but that source code is up on that repository already, and we've already talked about it, so that should be pretty self-explanatory. If you haven't started on project 2, start on the project 2 because it's a complex. I mean, it's pretty simple, but it's complex to get all these pieces working together. So all the code already exists in the example code. It's just you piecing these together. So that's the tricky part. So I don't mind showing this code to you, but at the same time, yeah, you should get this working and get it working tonight. And if you haven't, then we have questions on Thursday, because it's due on Thursday, right? Next Thursday. It's due on a Thursday. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to worry you. Yeah. So work through this now, because again, you're going to have questions about it, and I'll be able to answer questions on Thursday. And then, now that I know it's due next week, can't keep track of things, that you have your questions answered before the weekend, and that way you can work on it the weekend. So again, start early, start often, and I will see you guys Thursday. So come with questions, and I'll post this live stream. So I hope you enjoyed it.